And with that, I'd like to take just a quick moment here and introduce you. Some of you maybe for the first time, but I know to a lot of you this is an awful familiar face. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our host for today and one of our fellow coordinators, Dr. Dan Suter. He's the extension entomologist in the Department of Entomology at the University of Georgia's Griffin campus. He works closely with the structural pest control industry, homeowners, and county extension in support of the extension mission of UGA. And he has a small research program on pest ants. And Dr. Suter, the floor is yours.
Appreciate that, Richie. So welcome everybody on this nice, wherever you are. I hope it's sunny. It's sunny here in Georgia, in Griffin, Georgia. A little bit of overcast skies, but a little background to this webinar. We put together a webinar program for county extension agents here in Georgia, had proposed it last fall, and decided to really just open it up to colleagues around the Southeast. So contacted folks in Alabama, in Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, and queried their interest as to whether they might be interested in helping get the word out in their state on a webinar on fire ants, because at least here in Georgia, we have a lot of new county extension agents, and we have found that a lot of them need to be brought up to speed on fire ants. Everybody has fire ants. It's probably the same in other states. So I reached out to Sydney Crawley and Patty Alder at NC State. They were both more than willing to help out. And you're going to hear from both these individuals a little bit later in the program, where they're going to talk about their own programs on pest ants, and Patty will talk a little bit about her training programs. In Florida, I reached out to Faith Oy, known Faith for many years. Her and I were in grad school together years ago, and Faith has lots of contacts in extension, so she got the word out with Florida Extension. I can see there's a number of people that are here online with Florida Extension. And then Karen Vale is also in grad school with her, and Karen's at the University of Tennessee, a professor of extension, urban entomology at UT, and Karen is going to show this recording of this program to the county extension agents in her state as well. And then also over in Alabama, Caitlin is an assistant professor and extension specialist over in the entomology department there. And Caitlin was more than willing to get the word out there in Alabama. And then over at Clemson, I've known Vicki for quite some time as well. I used to see her at the fire ant conference. We have an outstanding group of speakers here with Dr. David Oy, Will Hudson, and Tim Davis. And our first speaker up this afternoon is Dr. David Oy. Dr. Oy is a research entomologist at the USDA-ARS Center for Medical, Agricultural, and Veterinary Entomology located in Gainesville, Florida. He conducts research on the chemical and biological control of imported fire ants, and he also works on the biology and control of other invasive pest ants, such as the tawny crazy ant and the little fire ant. You're going to hear a little bit more about the tawny crazy ant a little bit later. So Dr. Oy, I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to you, and you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Okay, I think that's how it should go, right?
That looks good, David.
Okay, good, great, thank you. Thanks, Dan, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel today. It's got to see some faces I haven't seen for a while. But as Dan mentioned, I'll be talking about fire ants of the southeastern U.S., a little bit about their history, identification, biology, and a little bit about some of the biocontrol efforts that have been made against fire ants. So let's just get started here. Okay, what I decided to do is just talk about fire ants. I'll talk a little bit about who, what, where, and how, and I'll focus here right now on who and who or what are the fire ants. So when we talk about fire ants, they're also known as imported fire ants, and these generally refer to the black imported fire ants, Solenopsis richteri, the red imported fire ant, Solenopsis invicta, and there's a hybrid between these two species. The black imported fire ants, as well as the red imported fire ants, both come from South America. They both entered into the Mobile, Alabama, Port of Mobile in Alabama. The black imported fire ants first, we estimate maybe around 1918. The black imported fire ants they prefer more temperate climates, so now they're distributed more in the northern areas of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Tennessee. Now, the red imported fire ants, again, accidentally introduced through the Port of Mobile, and this is much later, around 1933, and it does better in the warmer climates. So it's well distributed throughout the southern states, 14 southern states. as well as the two territories, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And this is a dominant species of the imported fire ant. So this is the one that we all deal with in general. And then you have the hybrid, and that's located between the overlap between the red and black. This is a reproductively viable hybrid. And generally, we distinguish these through GC analysis of their exoskeleton, their cuticular hydrocarbons, and there's also some genetic analyses that can be done too. So, but if you're just looking at them, at least for the black imported fire ants, as the name implies, they're a little bit darker than the red imported fire ants are more reddish black in color. And oftentimes you'll see this orange spot on their abdomen or gaster here, as well as in comparison to the red imported fire ants, they're a little bit lighter in color. They're reddish, dark brown in color, but there's no spot on their abdomen. You can see here. And as I mentioned, this is a dominant ant. And so most of the fire ant research is on the red imported fire ant. And a lot of the research does apply to black imported fire ants because they're very similar. If you want to get down to a little more individual ant diagnostic characteristics, some of the things that we look for is for the red imported fire ant, as well as a black, is the two-segmented pedestal. So this is a big character here that we use to divide the ants into two big groups. So there are many species with two segmented pedestals. So basically you have the thorax here, we have the legs coming off the thorax. Then you have the abdomen, which encompasses this whole area here. And in ants, this will have a pedestal. And sometimes it's one segmented and sometimes it's two segmented. And so in the red imported fire ant is two segmented. It also has these two little nodes or bumps on it. And then another thing that it can be used to help diagnose, if you're just looking at an individual ant, is that it would have a 10-segmented antenna. So if you count the segments of the antenna, including this first long one here, the scape, that's included, and the rest, there'll be 10 of them, and it includes this, whoops. Let's see if I can go back. It includes this two-segmented club. So these are segments 9 and 10 here. But the most diagnostic characteristic for the fire ant, the red imported fire ant, is this median tooth on the edge of the clypeus. And the clypeus is sometimes we may think of it as the upper lip here. So this is the clypeus here for the head of the fire ant, red imported fire ant. And you see these two teeth here. These are the two clypal tooth. But in between, in the red imported fire ant, there's a small little tooth right inside here. So you can follow this little hair, but you can see this little nub here, and that's the median tooth. And it sometimes can be hard to see, but under a scope, you can put up the magnification, you can see it there. But be forewarned that sometimes in these older ants, still the tooth will be worn down a little bit. But in general, the easiest way to, and you all know this, to know if you have a fire ant is look for a nest, and if you disturb it like this, the ants will boil out, and they would go out and try and sting you. So that's one quick way. And then if you got stung, you can see if that sting develops into a little white pustule. And so there's some medical papers that indicate that the white pustule is diagnostic for the red imported fire ant sting. So this poor picture here of this child with nice pustules here, these take about 24 hours to develop, this little white pustule. Of course, there's also some variations. So sometimes a pustule will not develop. Sometimes it's itchy and you might just scratch it off. In rare cases, people that are allergic to the fire ants will suffer anaphylaxis, and this is generally less than 1% of those that are stung. And very rarely, death will occur. I just want to show you this comparison of some of these sting reactions after about 24 hours. And my colleague, Stanford Porter, and I were in the lab once, and we had these different colonies, and we said, let's see what the sting reactions are for these different Solenopsis species. So here we have the red imported fire ant, Solenopsis invicta, and you can see that telltale white pustule. This is Solenopsis geminata. This is a tropical fire ant, so you'll find that in the southeast. You'll run across that, but it doesn't have that nice little pustule, maybe a little bit of a welt here. And we also happen to have a colony of Solenopsis xyloni. This is a southern fire ant. It's found more, at least now it's found more in the southwestern area and in California. And it has this little dimple here, and you also have this little welt. So again, you have these diagnostics sting things just for your own interest. More recently, another one of our colleagues here at the lab that we work at, the USDA, Stephen Valles, he developed this lateral assay for identification of fire ants. It's like a pregnancy test. And it's now being marketed by Agdia, and it's under the trade name Invictitech. And this is for the red imported fire ant, and just came out with another one, Invictitech Plus. And this will distinguish the red imported fire ant, the black imported fire ant, and the hybrid all in one test and reaction. So this is generally marketed to ag inspectors and maybe to countries that just recently have new infestation. You can go buy it online. But what they'll do is, if you're inspecting some cargo on a truck and then you don't see a fire ant mound or anything like that, you just see some ants running around and you collect them if you don't know what they are. And sometimes or oftentimes you'll have to send them off for identification and they'll delay the shipment. So with this test, you can take those live ants and just squash them up and put them into this cartridge here, and you'll get a reaction within 10 minutes as whether or not you have red imported fire ants, or I guess in this case, you can also have, if you have the right test, tell between the black and the hybrid. But these are all quarantined anyway. So for the ag inspector, that's all they need to know. And again, this uses the species-specific venom proteins of the red imported fire as well as the black imported fire to distinguish between the species. So that's just something relatively recent that's now available. So let's talk a little bit about, we talked about who the fire ants are, but so what are the problems they cause? I'm sure most of you are familiar with what the problems that they cause, but just quickly review. They attack wildlife. This poor hatchling is being fed upon by fire ants and stung by them. Big problem in pastures as well as in turf classes. You'll hear later on today in your lawns and recreation areas. Also, big problem on crops. So there can be a big problem on crops. In this case, you see some fire ants feeding on an okra bud. They'll girdle citrus trees and things like that. And they're also big quarantine pests, in the sense that for nurseries, if you're trying to ship plants outside of, or nursery stock outside of the fire ant quarantine area, you have to make sure your plants are certified fire ant free. And what's unique is that fire ants are classified as a public health pest. And that's because, of course, again, they have these aggressive stings, stinging behavior that can lead to anaphylaxis. This is an old picture from the University of Florida when they first moved in there at the entomology department, and there was a fire ant nest excavation inside the hallway here. And again, we mentioned that the fire ants can occasionally cause deaths, and this will can result in lawsuits and over $1 million settlements. So again, it's a big problem in many different areas. So there's been economic analyses on trying to determine what's the economic impact of fire ants. And in the US, it's estimated to be over $8 billion annually. This is from a report by economists in 2006, and now we just adjusted this to 2021 dollars. And it's over 85% of the damage is in expenditures are in urban areas, and this excludes the lawsuits. And in the late 1990s, the red imported fire ant has spread internationally. It's reported in Mexico, big infestation in Australia, it's moved to Taiwan, mainland China. It's been reported on several new islands or different islands in the West Indies or in the Caribbean. And most recently, it's been found in Japan as well as in South Korea. And in Australia, they've done several economic impact studies, and the estimates have ranged from potential impacts of $1.32 billion to $33.4 billion, depending on the type of model they use and the assumptions. But anyway, this huge impact has precipitated Australia to implement a 10-year eradication program. And they're right in the middle of it. It started in 2017, and they allocated $305 million US for this program. So it's quite an effort to try and get rid of these fire ants. So where are the fire ants? This is pertaining to the US here. This is a federal imported fire ant quarantine map from APHIS. And as I mentioned, the fire ants are in 14 US states, mainly here in the South, the Southeast, South, and you have a pocket in New Mexico and in Southern California, and it's creeping up into Virginia. And so right now there's this map, it's estimated to be about 365 million. And there's this nice study done by Anne-Marie Calcott and Homer Collins way back in 1996, and they were trying to document the spread of fire ants from when they first entered the U.S. And you can see here early on, there's a small infestation, but then eventually it started to explode. And what's interesting here that there was no quarantine issue instituted until 1958, many years after the 1933 introduction of the red imported fire ants, and even more so with the blacks. And it's just cat's out of the bag just in many states by this time, and it just keeps spreading. And of course, there's more surveys done, more of the Quarantine Institute, there's more formal surveys done of where the fire ants are. So in 1995, you have maybe 282 million acres infested. And as I mentioned just on the other slide, it's now up to 365 million acres. And of course, a lot of the reason for this spread is through the transport of infested materials. It's human transport. But the fire ants also can spread naturally. And so they have these wing reproductives, and this is the female reproductive, and here's the male. You know, they're different morphologically. The male has a smaller head, it's darker in color, and also has these, quote, big shoulders. I guess you have lots of flight muscles in here. So what the fire ants will do is they'll have these mating flights. And so when the conditions are right, usually in the late spring, early summer, and it can happen all year round in a warm area like Florida. But when you're a little bit cooler, it's more in the seasonal, late spring, early summer, and throughout the summer too. But after heavy rain the day following, it's usually nice and humid. If it's nice and warm and there's low wind, and the fire ants will start to agitate and they'll start digging holes in their mounds. And then they'll start to crawl up, the wing reproductives will start to crawl up the tallest point on their nest. And you can see here up the grass blade here. In this case, we stuck some popsicle sticks inside a nest. And you can see them going up to the top, and they'll take off and have a mating flight. But generally, the males will fly first, maybe from a different nest or a different area. They'll be hovering up in the air, several hundred feet up in the air. Then the females will fly up and they will mate. And then the males, that's their purpose in life. So they'll land and they'll die or get eaten by some other predator on the ground, bird or whatever. The females will land, and then they'll start to look for a place to start a nest. They'll also drop their wings, or sometimes I've seen them actually reach back with their head and actually grab it with their jaws and pull it off. But then they'll find some kind of crack or crevice. Another favorite spot to look is under nursery pots. They'll be under there, or maybe a group of them under there, and they'll begin to start a colony. And I have a video here of a mating flight being initiated. So let's see if we can see that. Here you go. You can see the ants crawling in, again, off the top of the tall pieces of grass here, weeds, and then they'll start to take off. And interesting story is years ago, and we were, Faith and I and Colin were at Disney World. Colin was in a stroller, and Faith, I forget, she was getting some drinks or something. But all of a sudden, I see these people. They're walking by and they're waving their hands and saying, "What is this? What's going on?" And I see these little kids stomping on things. And I took a closer look, and they're fire ant queens. And we were in a mating flight, and the fire ant queens had mated, and they were falling down. It was like rain. It was amazing. And so, of course, I got an old cup and I started collecting them, because we'll raise these individual queens into colonies and use these for our research. But that's all a neat story. Until it happens, you don't realize how many fire ants are out there, and it will just drop down literally like rain. And that's why it's a constant battle. They'll constantly come and reinfest new areas and start new problems. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I mentioned about the queens. So now we're getting to how they're becoming such a big problem, or how they are, or why they're such a big problem. So the big thing is a queen here. They have a huge capacity for reproduction. So she can lay, when she's mature, maybe after a year or so, up to 2,000 eggs per day. And so you have a bunch of worker ants, and they'll all take care of her, keep her clean, feed her. And if she lays an egg, a little worker ant will grab that egg and grab it and take that egg to the area where they raise their other young. So it's efficient. They'll keep all their young brood together, and their little older brood or larvae live in a different section. And so if you kick open a fire mound, you also see these little white things, and this is what it is. This is the young brood here. So you'll have little eggs like this. They have 4 instars. So the first instar is not much bigger than the egg. Then you'll have a second, which is probably somewhere in this little clump. Oftentimes you'll see ants, fire ants, carrying these clumps of brood, young brood. And as they grow older, these are all 4th instars here. You can see these a lot easier. But the 4th instar are interesting in the fact that solid foods, ants will bring solid foods back to the nest, place that solid food on the, the ventral side, or like the right under the chin of the fourth instar larvae, and the larvae will secrete digestive juices to liquefy that solid food. Some of you may have heard about eat grits. They'll ingest it and they'll drink water, and the grit will expand and they'll die. Well, that's not true, because they don't take in the solid food. They'll bring it back to the nest, but they generally will try and liquefy it first, and then they'll spread it around to the rest of their colony mates. So anyway, the life cycle for ants in general is a complete life cycle. So you have your eggs, and you have your larvae, then you have your pupae, or if you're thinking of butterflies, more of a cocoon stage here, but this is a non-feeding stage. This is feeding. And then as it gets older, it'll start to darken up or melanize just before it can turn into an adult. And then you have these adults coming off. And for fire ants, you have a gradual range of sizes here. So we have these small ones, which we term minors, and you have these larger ones, which we call majors. It's a nice nice picture by Sanford Porter here. This slide also is a famous slide he did years ago, but this again, a major worker and a minor worker. And if you remember, no spot on the red imported fire ant, like the black sap. So major workers will often live longer. So oftentimes they'll be out foraging for food. And the minor workers will maybe tend the young and tend the queen, but they're very flexible in what their behavioral jobs or tasks that they do. So it's not hard and fast. Okay, so the fire ants, they have their colony and they'll live in a nest or in a mound. And so this is just to show you some differences relative to the soil types. Some place where it's more sandy, like in Florida, you'll have mounds that may look like this, maybe not as well formed, a little more flat and spread out. This was taken when we were in Alabama. Nice red clay here, and you have this nice hard formed mound here. And interesting, some of these mounds may not be inhabited. They'll be abandoned, and they'll be in another mound. It may look worse than it is. They're all over the place, and it's still can be bad. So this is the anatomy of a fire ant nest or mound, or some place they call them beds. So you have soil surface right here. This is a casting by Walter Schinkel, metal casting. And so you have the soil surface here. And so you have all these tunnels. And so what do they do with all that dirt that they have to excavate to make these tunnels? Well, they pile it right on top and make some more tunnels. So you have like a mirror image here for the fire ant nest. And then you have some foraging tunnels coming out. So they'll keep them protected, and they'll exit out here and go collect food, come back and bring it back to the colony. You also may have some tunnels to a water table, to some moisture source, because the fire ants, they do need that moisture. They don't like it when it's just a very dry habitat. And what they'll do here is they'll use this as like a thermal regulation device. So you have your brood and your queens, and the workers will carry those things, their brood and the queens, up and down this nest depending on the temperature. So if it's really hot or really cold, they'll have the nest, they'll have their brood and their queen down below where it's a little more insulated. If it's cool weather and maybe a sunny, cold winter morning, they may bring them all up into the upper part. If you have some sun shining onto the upper part of the mound, it'll be nice and warm, and that's where they'll be. And so if you disturb the nest, of course, some of it will run out and try and sting you, but not everybody. So the other ones will grab the brood, they'll grab the queen, and take her down below to protect them. So they got this all worked out. So again, that's why they're such a dominant pest. This is a nest cell of a fire ant colony that we raised in a lab. It's maybe 30,000 ants. But I'm going to show you is evidence of the foraging workers. They bring back the food that is shared with other colony members, like many other social insect species. They do this trophallaxis, where they'll share the food among their colony or nest mates. So here we have some oil that's dyed blue. Fire ants will ingest the oil, and you can see a kind of a blue tinge here. We notice the larvae. Also notice the larvae, the blue tinge is more toward the center, and on the outside here will be the pupae. So they're, again, being very efficient. All the stages that have to be fed are all together. The ones that don't are in a different section. But if we take a closer look, you can see this dyed food is now in the larvae here, and even closer, you can see some of their fat bodies that oil dye inside them. So again, very efficient way of feeding their colonies. Another important aspect of fire ants are that they have two social forms, unique. You have a single queen form, one queen per colony. You also term them monogyne, versus you have these other populations of fire ants that are multiple queen or polygyne. You can have, a minimum of 2 queens or as many as 400 or more queens in a single colony. So some of the differences between the two is that single queen fire ants are territorial. In other words, the ants will fight from different colonies. And because of that, you'll see them spaced out like this. And you can have maybe 7 million ants per acre and 250,000 ants per colony and maybe 40 to 150 nests per acre. And this depends on how old the population is. If it's a younger population and the colonies are smaller, they can be, have smaller nests that are closer together. They won't have such a large territory. But when it's a mature infested area, maybe only 40 nests per acre, but there'll be bigger colonies for sure. Multiple queen forms are non-territorial. So they won't fight, they'll share resources, they'll move back and forth between nests. They may be, 14 million ants per acre, twice as many ants per colony, and maybe 200 to 800 nests per acre in a really bad infestation. So literally you'll be walking from one nest to another in a heavily infested area. And before we used to dig up the colonies and to figure out which social form they are and count the queens. Also, the worker sizes are a little more uniform in the multiple queen colonies. They're a little bit smaller. They're all about the same size. Like the single queens will have more of that gradation of fire ants that I showed you earlier. But now we can use some genetic testing, use a PCR to determine between the two social forms. But again, the predominant form in fire ant is the single queen form. That's the major social form that we have here. Okay, so I talked a little bit about fire ants. There can be problems in many different landscapes or different types of areas, in the rural area and urban areas, but within these sites, they have their preferred habitats. And so fire ants, and that's where they'll make their nests. And so fire ants are generally like human disturbed areas, such as roadsides, or if you're clearing lands for developments or logging, or you have controlled burns. Those kinds of human interactions activities will displace the native ants, and the native ants will have a harder time recovering, and the fire ants will quickly fill the void. So they're kind of like a weedy species. They'll fill in where it's empty, and of course, again, with their high reproduction, they'll proliferate. But they also like moisture. They originate from the South American river basin, lived in a swampy, floody area, so they can float. And so you'll see something like this. Well, they'll have their brood and their queens all inside this ball, and they'll float along, and they'll hit a higher ground, and then they can start their nest in that higher ground. So they do some rain and some irrigation, but generally they don't want it flooded, but they can't survive the flooding. They also like it warm. So open areas with the southern exposure often will be the sites that you can look for fire ants if you're trying to figure out where the problem is going to be. In the winter, they'll look for heat sinks. Look at this cemetery marker. You can see the nests right next to this stone here that will collect heat. But their nest locations will change with the seasons. In the summer, they may be too hot, so they'll move into a more shaded area, maybe partly under a tree or something like that. But generally, for a poor habitat for fire ants, they don't like that heavy shade, dark shade, like deep in the forest, and they don't like it dry. If you have a pasture that has lots of deep stand, you won't see as many fire ants in that type of situation. So now I'm going to transition a little bit into biocontrols, but I want to give you a quick overview of some of the fire ant control programs that have occurred. So initially, when the fire ants first came in, there were problems. So they try and do a quick fix. They rely on insecticides. So in 1937, 1948, they had these programs where they're trying to treat individual nests with contact insecticide. Basically, they're drenching mound with some kind of insecticide to kill the ants. And later on, 1957, 1960, they actually tried an eradication in southern U.S. with these very toxic insecticide. They dropped it by air as well as by ground. This is heptachlor and dieldrin. And this, would actually kill wildlife. You had cattle being killed. And this was written about in the Rachel Carson's book in Silent Spring. She had a chapter on the fire and eradication program. So that eventually was stopped. And then I just also want to again put in the 1958. That's when the fire ant quarantine was first established. So again, late in the game, and fire ants had spread quite a bit throughout the southern U.S. And then later on, they developed the ant baits. Again, they're using that trophalactics or the food sharing behavior of ants to help spread insecticide. And this is from 1962 to 78. They had a control program with Myrex bait, actually dropping that in the southern states by air. But that eventually got banned. And so actually the lab that I'm working in now, they were charged with trying to find an alternative to Myrex. And in 1980, the Amdro was developed. So you see Amdro still on the market now. And then there's a bunch of other types of fire ant baits that are available. But in the meantime, there was some effort to look at biological control for the fire ants. So in 1962 to 1969, they were working on this parasitic ant. It's called Solenopsis doggeri. At the time, it was called Lavicina doggeri. This is in Uruguay. And they were looking at that. And also, from 1971 to 79, there were a lot of natural enemy surveys, both in South America as well as in the US. This is done by universities as well as the USDA. And finally, in 1997, the first fire and biocontrols were imported into the US and established. And this is forward flies was the first one that was actually brought in from South America and established here. And now we're moving into trying to combine biocontrols with insecticide usage and more of an IPM approach. Let's talk a little bit more about these self-sustaining biocontrols. Again, fire ants came from South America, so there's probably lots of natural enemies in fire ants in South America. The problem of fire ants is not as, I guess, intense as it is here in the U.S. in most areas. So we're trying to bring in biocontrol agents to help control them here in the U.S. And so we looked at fire ant pathogens, and I'll talk most today on Microsporidia. This is Neola-Hazia solenopsis, as well as some viruses that have been discovered, mainly this virus here, SINV3. And of course, we'll talk about these fire ant decapitating forward flies. And right now, there's 6 species that have been established here in the U.S. So let's talk a little bit about the Microsporidia. This is a Neola-Hazia solenopsis. Originally, or formerly, was called Theolahania solenopsis. So you'll see this in the literature. But Microsporidia are a phylum closely related to fungi, and what they'll do is they have these spores like this, and the ants will ingest these spores, or whatever the host will ingest the spores, and the spores will eventually shoot out a tube that will penetrate a cell, and the contents of the spore will get into that cell and infect that cell, and they'll proliferate inside the ant or the host. And here we have a cleared fire ant. You can see this fat body. It's full of these, their fat body cells are full of these spores. Eventually, these infections will get into the queen. They'll actually get into her ovaries, and they'll reduce her brood production, maybe 88 to 100%. But it'll take time, maybe 6 to 12 months. And we also reported earlier death of queens from these infected colonies. And here's a picture of a more healthy queen. And this queen, a little bit smaller. Eventually, the queens become debilitated and become much smaller and skinnier, and they'll die. So you get some colony death that way. The fire ant viruses, this is a more recent area of work. Again, my colleague here, Stephen Vallis, he's discovered the first one. But now there's 15 viruses found in fire ants, both from South America and North America. But the most virulent one, the one we've been working with the most, is Solenopsis invictivirus 3, or SINV3. And it's associated with lab colony decline and death. And it infects all life stages. And it's persistent and very prevalent in the lab. In fact, we got this contaminated into our rearing facilities and had a hard time rearing colonies up, for our experiments. And so we had to implement these extreme hygiene procedures where we do a lot of bleaching and try to minimize our contact with the different colonies within the lab. And we suspect, actually we're pretty sure now, that it's virus particles are on the cuticle of the ants. And the ants die, the pieces break off, and it becomes like dust, and it's in the air, and you get the infection that way. And so we have made some successful field inoculations of this virus in California, as well as uninfected areas in Florida. And lastly, let's talk about a little bit about these fire ant decapitating forward flies. Again, these are very specific to fire ants. They're very tiny. They don't bother people or animals. They're so tiny, they're the size of a head of an ant. So here's a forward fly swooping in to attack a fire ant. It'll come down here. It'll lay its egg probably on the underside or on the side of the thorax here, where the ant can't grab the egg and pull it out. Eventually that egg will turn into hatch into a maggot, and the maggot will make its way into the fire ant body, and eventually make its way into its head, and then it will secrete some enzymes, and then the head will fall off. And then the larvae will form a preparium within this head capsule, and eventually it will develop into an adult fly, and the fly will eventually pop out, and then you'll start the cycle all over again. So right now, there's 6 species established in the U.S., and they've been introduced over the years. From 1997 was the first successful release to 2010. And they introduced these different species because they prefer different types of fire ants with different traits. The size of the ants, some prefer large ants, some prefer medium, some prefer the very small ones, small fire ants. There are some biotypes that prefer the red imported fire ant versus the black imported fire ant. Some attack the ants more while they're by the nest, if you disturb the nest. Or there's one species that likes to attack fire ants while it's trailing, looking for food. And they also can be active at different times of the day. Oftentimes they'll be when it's blistering hot out, when the sun's full out, wide open. And other times there's some species that like it when it's more in the evening, or towards sunset, or even sunrise, when the light is dim. So they have these different traits to try and fill all these different niches of the different behaviors of fire ants. But again, the main impact of fire ant decapping flies is the disruption of foraging. So here's just an example. It's been reported as made as high as 83% disruption. So what happens is the fire ants will hide and cease movement to try and avoid being parasitized by the ants. So here's an example here. You have some Vienna sausage in a little container here, and the ants are happily feeding on it. And look who's coming to dinner. Is this little forage fly here, and you notice that ants are starting to vacate this nice meal that they were feeding on. And so where they go, they went hiding. They went underneath this little cap, and oftentimes they'll be in this little C-shaped posture, they'll curl up and be still. So I often think of this analogy of if you going out to buy food at the supermarket, but you knew a mosquito, if it bit you, your head would eventually fall off. You'd be quite stressed, and you're trying to avoid being bit. So same with the fire ants, they're trying to avoid being attacked by these flies, and this disrupts their normal foraging behavior. And we're thinking that it'll make their colonies weaker because they can't forage as efficiently, and maybe the other ants to compete better with them as well. And another aspect is if they do get parasitized, and of course they'll die, their head will fall off, but this is only estimated to be about less than 2% of the colony will have this direct parasitism or death from being attacked by the flies. So not a whole lot when you consider the size of a fire ant colony. So where are these biocontrol agents? The distribution of the fire ant pathogens for the microsporidia, the Neohazeia, it's reported from 12 states. And this is just through, some states did some formal surveys. Lots of it is just through arbitrary sampling. While we're doing some studies, we'll check to see if we can find the pathogen. But it's quite widespread. SINB3 is reported from 5 states, and there have been no systematic surveys of this. I bet you that it would probably be even more widespread. Fire ant decapitating forage flies. 3 species have spread extensively through the fire ant quarantine area. The first release was this Pseudactyon tricuspis. They did some formal surveys in 2011. 2011, and maybe 70% of the area had these, you can find these flies, but it's being displaced by other species, probably by this one here, Pseudactyon curvatus. This one specializes in the smaller fire ants, and so there are lots of small fire ants in the colony. 2011, they'd say about 90%, but I think Stanford Porter, I was talking to him, even though he's retired, he still keeps tabs on this. He thinks probably nearly 100% of the quarantine area you can find curvatus. And then you have this other one, obtusus, 25%, mainly found in Florida, Texas, and Georgia. The other 3 species, they're probably limited to a single state, but they're probably still expanding. But the bottom line is we want to know what are the biocontrols actually doing to fire ant populations out in the field. And so that's a little higher bar to meet or to figure out. So with the Neohazeia, in some of our studies, inoculated sites, we get reductions of maybe 63%. And I know in Argentina, they had a site that was maybe 83%. But these smaller sites, these reductions are due to smaller colony sizes. It's not like we're eliminating 63% of the colonies. The nests are just getting smaller. So you still have colonies out there. But one thing that's, again, there's smaller populations. But one thing that's very interesting is if the infection gets into monogyne colonies or single queen colonies, these colonies eventually will peter out because once the queen gets infected, she's not producing anymore and the colony will die. In contrast, if you look at infections in the multiple queen colonies, this is where we'll find most of the infections. Not all the queens are infected at the same time. So some will stop producing, but other ones will still producing. So you have a shrinkage of the colony size, but the colony is still motoring on a little bit. And this is similar with the SINV3. There is reductions in sizes of the colonies, as well as some of these nests will die out. And we also documented their spread to non-inoculated colonies. But just as a caveat, this is from a very small field test. What about the forage flies? Forage flies have a lot of publicity. And so Lloyd Morrison wrote this paper in 2012, and he worked here at our lab as well as in Texas on forage flies. He's very knowledgeable. He did a very objective analysis. And he thought the forage fly impact would be considered weak out in the field because he said that the fire ants can compensate for this foraging disruption. So they'll forage at night when the forage flies are inactive. Forage flies aren't flying around at night. As a counter argument, there's those defensive behaviors seen in the fire ants are still being maintained. The freezing behavior, the avoidance behavior, so that indicates that the forage flies still must impact the ants. And also an interesting item here is that both the Mycosporidia as well as the SINV3 as well as other viruses have been detected in the forage flies, but so far we haven't found evidence of the flies actually vectoring these pathogens. So just kind of wrapping up here, fire ants are not a silver bullet. I think they do represent an option for long-term control of invasive ants, like fire ants. And I think there are other natural enemies out there. I think we do some continued work with this, and hopefully we'll bring enough biocontrol agents that will eventually lead to some kind of acceptable level of fire ant control by natural enemies. Boy, I think I ran out of time. I'm sorry. But just wanted to leave you with this picture for some of those who remember years ago when I used to talk about fire ants and biocontrols.
That's not who I think it is it?
Yes, it is.
Wow.
He doesn't want to help me anymore.
And he's graduating from college in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, next week.
Wow, hard to believe. Time marches on, man.
That's right.
Thanks, David. That was really good stuff.
Thank you.
A few questions came in, and I'll go ahead and pass those on to you, but we'll take a question. There are a couple here on control that are probably more appropriate for Will or Tim, so I'll just go on and pose those to those guys. But
okay.
What about the march north of fire ants? Fire ants came introduced into the South, and really haven't seemed to move any further north than Virginia. What do you think? What's happening with the march north with red and blue?
Fire ants?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely marching north. They're moving into Virginia. Some of the counties there's a grad student, I think, at Virginia Tech is looking at this, and I think she has mapped out different counties where the fire ants have spread north. In Tennessee, I remember when we first started working in Tennessee, we're carrying this. All the southern counties were infested, but now it's all the way up to the northern counties in Tennessee. So it's warming up. There's more urban development, and those urban areas are warm, and fire ants can survive that too. Yeah, they're definitely spreading.
All right, very good. I think we'll go ahead and move on. I'll forward you some of these other questions, David. By the way, for you the folks that are listening, you're going to get an email after this webinar, and you can pose these same questions. But I'm writing down the questions, and we'll get those to you as well, David. So appreciate it, David. I think you're muted. Thank you. Okay, next up on today's agenda is Dr. Will Hudson. Will's going to talk about management of fire ants in urban and suburban environments, golf courses, athletic fields, residential homes, and that kind of thing. Dr. Hudson has been an extension entomologist here at the University of Georgia since 1988. He's responsible for insect pest management programs in turf and ornamentals, permanent grass pastures and hayfields and pecans. In addition to his extension responsibilities, he also teaches courses in turf pest management, ornamentals, IPM, and leads a graduate discussion course in IPM. His current applied research projects include the study of the biology and management of the newly invasive Bermuda grass stem maggot and control of ambrosia beetles in nurseries, landscapes, and pecan orchards. Dr. Hudson, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, and I'll mute myself.
All right, thanks, Dan. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And while I'm doing that, let me just say that the thing we're all waiting for is when fire ants get to Washington, D.C. I didn't share my screen, did I?
That's got it.
You got it?
Yeah, you got it.
All right, because once fire ants get to Washington, D.C., think of the money that will flow into that lab down there in Gainesville. I mean, David will be able to build him an extra house down the Bahamas or somewhere. They're still above water. I've been asked to talk to you about managing fire ants in urban and suburban environments. And I'm going to start off by reminding you of a few. Can you guys see this slide?
Yes. Can you hit screen? We see your slide.
I could if I knew what that was. Never mind. I'm good if you are.
This will work.
All right, some of the facts, and David did a great job of going over these, but just to remind you of a few of the things that impact our decisions in trying to manage fire ants in our environments, as opposed to what Tim's going to talk to you about, some of the more agricultural or rural environments. Fire ant queens live a long time. The individual workers probably far less. They're definitely far less. I think the laboratory numbers are about 60 to 90 days. I would guess in nature, that's probably not anywhere near that long because ants get stepped on and stuff like that. But this difference between the queen and the individual ant is important when we talk about what we should expect from bait applications, for instance. A mature colony, anywhere from a couple hundred to maybe 300,000 or 400,000 workers. That you need to keep that number in mind if you decided that your goal in life is to kill every individual worker fire ant in your yard with some sort of pyrethroid insecticide. You're going to be at it a long time because the queen, if she's in prime shape, can lay 1,000 or, as David said, even a couple of thousand eggs per day. So these numbers impact how we decide to approach managing fire ants. Control is sometimes a tricky word to use. What we really are aiming at now after all these years is finding a way to keep the number of fire ants in and around where we are to a level that we can stand. So we worry about fire ants for a lot of reasons, way more than $5 billion probably at this point, just in the urban environment, urban and suburban environment. The medical thing and the treatment of those things, you saw the pustules, but I would also say that it hasn't been very many years ago down in Florida where a woman from somewhere where they don't have fire ants came down to the beach and got stung, and she was so sensitive to Hymenopteran venom that apparently a single ant sting caused her to go into anaphylactic shock and die. There's an extreme range of reaction to fire ant stings, and almost all of them are unpleasant. The cost of control is enormous, the cost in equipment, and Tim's going to talk to you about managing fire ants around electrical equipment, but this is a chronic problem for us on golf courses and nurseries and anywhere where you have irrigation systems with the controller set right along at the ground level, which is almost everywhere. And of course the quarantine, which impacts the ornamentals trade because all of those pots that are produced in nurseries in Georgia and Florida and South Carolina and Alabama and Tennessee have to have a little bit of pesticide added to the potting medium, and they have to satisfy phytosanitary requirements before they can be shipped to places like California. So all of these things make a big difference to a lot of different segments of our population. But for people down in the South, this is the thing. That heat sink there, which is a driveway in this case, that is a place where fire ants pop up early in the spring when just coming out of winter, like around, it's warmer there. They can put their part of their colony, the mound up underneath there. So they really absorbs a lot of heat on a sunny day, and it keeps them warm and provides optimal growth conditions for the brood next to planted beds, because this is usually a disturbed area. Maybe there's a lot of bark, and it's also probably irrigated. All of those things are conducive to fire ants being successful. And then out in turf areas, and in particular golf courses, athletic fields, just park areas, the mounds themselves are unsightly, and there are a lot of other problems that arise from having fire ants in and around where we are recreating. So here to me is the real core of what we need to think about as we approach managing fire ants. You have to think of the colony as the target and not the individual ants. And if you're talking about inside the house, maybe you can attack individual ants, but even there, you've got to find a way to put a stop to the colony or you're never going to get control of the situation. There are different strategies appropriate in different situations. If you think of large areas, maybe a park or an athletic complex or a business office park or something like that, versus a suburban lot that may be only about a quarter acre total and far less than half of that would be grass and outdoor area. You've got intense use versus the background. So if it's next to a child's playground or right up around your patio, that's one thing. It's a whole nother thing if it's, again, that office park area or commercial area where no one ever goes out in the grass. It's just a background aesthetic thing. And then there's the cost, because there's a vast difference between all of these strategies, and that makes a difference in what you choose. And a lot of that comes back to this bottom one, where you recognize that there's a big difference between no mounds and no ants. And a lot of the baits, Amdro in particular, when it first came out, promised right there on the label that if you applied it twice a year, you would have no mounds. It never said no ants, but a lot of people buying Amdro to treat for fire ants thought they were going to have no ants, and that simply isn't a reasonable expectation. That's another one of those things. If the biology, you can manage your expectations and decide what you want to do. So no mounds versus no ants. Around a children's playground, you really need no ants for a number of reasons. If you're a daycare center, you're liable to get sued if a child is stung by fire ants. Same for schools. It's just a dangerous thing for the smaller a person is, the less venom it takes to cause a reaction if they're sensitive. It's just a common sense thing that you don't want fire ants around these playground areas. If you're on a golf course, if it's the green up here, you don't want any mounds because they deflect the roll of the ball. And I don't know how many of you are golfers. I don't want to step on any toes, but golfers are crazy. And if the ball goes off to the side, they're gonna want some sort of payback on that. And their playing partners, who are almost always competitors, are going to argue strongly that they shouldn't get any relief at all. On the other hand, if you're out here in the fairway or in the rough of the collar around the green, a small mound is not that big a deal. It's an aesthetic problem here. It affects the play of the ball up here on the green. And then lastly, I would suggest you think about athletic fields. This is a small mound just starting up on a soccer field. On a soccer field, people don't stand around all that much, and the ones that do, if they're from the South, know not to stand in that ant mound. So having a few small mounds off to the side is not that big a deal. Even out in the field is not that big a deal. But if this were a football field, and you're practicing or playing a game early in the season or any time in the season down in Florida, if you're on the bottom of the pile, then you don't want no mounds, you want no ants, because you're going to be laying there until somebody gets off of you, and the ants will take advantage of that. There are very different requirements and expectations for these different sorts of situations, and knowing what the use is and what the demands of the client might be, that is what you use to decide how you're going to approach managing the fire ants. So the basic fire ant control program that's being used all across the South is one that was developed quite a few years ago when there was a very large multi-state fire ant program that was actually centered, I think, in Texas A&M. They were the lead on the grant. But the two-step program involves putting out baits twice a year, and then use mound treatments of one sort or another for the established colonies within the area that you're trying to control the ants. And then after you've done that a couple of times, you shouldn't have any mounds at all. You just but you have to continue putting out the bait on that regular basis, or else the ants will reinvade. This is an excellent approach. It has proved to be quite successful and very effective if the area is large enough. And the sort of breaking point for me is somewhere around an acre. If it's an acre or larger, then this is hands down the best approach. If it's smaller than that, especially if the area is in a suburban setting where there are a lot of houses in acre, half acre, quarter acre lots, the problem is that if you treat your yard, you're still going to have ants foraging over into your yard from your neighbor's yard. And so that becomes frustrating and a friction point between you and your neighbor, and nobody wants that. So there have been some attempts, and some pretty successful attempts, to organize bait application on a neighborhood basis where everybody would treat their yard with the same bait at the same time and stay on the schedule, and everybody would be mound free and largely ant free at that point. But you got to have the cooperation of everyone, because if you leave a refuge anywhere, one or two people who choose not to treat their yard for whatever reason, then that makes the whole thing far less effective than it should be. And then there's also the broadcast or contact treatments that are used on plots like your small suburban yard, or just around in certain areas where you need a different level of control than what's offered by the two-step program. So again, those baits, fairly cheap, and there are quite a few of them. I'll show you a partial list here in a little while. You should be able to put out the baits twice a year for somewhere between $20 and $30 an acre. And that's been pretty consistent. That price hasn't changed a whole lot in the last 15 or 20 years. It is a little bit slow for reasons that we will talk about, and some of which David has already brought up. It takes somewhere between 2 or 3 to as long as 8 weeks for control to kick in, depending on which bait you choose and other things about your situation. It's the best option by far for large areas. And there are lately a couple of brands of what are called fast baits that instead of 3 weeks, take 3 days to reduce or eliminate fire ant activity in the area. And the reason these baits are slow is the workers pick them up and carry them back to the mound. The workers don't eat the bait, as David told you about offering it to the immatures and then taking that liquid and feeding it to the other immatures and to the queen. That's how the toxicant or insect growth regulator, that's the active ingredient in the bait, gets spread around the colony. But it's almost always effective primarily on the queen and on the developing brood, and far less effective on worker ants, the adult worker ants, and also the very mature brood that are in the pupal stage, because they're non-feeding, so they didn't get a dose. So you can either sterilize or kill the queen and stop the development, or kill the most of the brood, but then you've just got to wait it out until all those worker ants die. And again, in theory, they could live 2 to 3 months. Most likely it's going to be more like 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. But that's why there's this delay after you apply a fire ant bait before you begin to see the sort of reduction in fire ant activity that you would like. And that's also why in the two-step program, you put out the bait, let those workers take it back to the mound and feed it to the queen and the brood, and then come along after 2 or 3 days or a week and do a mound treatment to take out the remaining workers that otherwise you just have to wait for them to get old and die. The broadcast or contact treatments, these, of course, you broadcast a bait, but this is broadcast of contact insecticides. These are insecticides that kill the ants on contact, as the name might imply. It's pretty quick. You spray a pyrethroid on a fire ant, it will kill him. But he will not carry it back to the mound and feed it to the brood or the queen. So you're going to have to just wait. You're going to have no impact there at all. And you're just taking out the actively foraging part of the population. And as you can, if you pile up 10,000 fire ants in a mound, you think you have really done a lot of good. But compare that to the 200 or 300,000 workers that are in that colony, and you really haven't done anything at all. So to me, controlling fire ants with this approach is something for a retired person with no, there are some, let me also say that there are also some products in this that actually can control the ants very effectively for up to a year, but you're going to pay $200 an acre for those treatments. Your mound treatments with liquid drenches, there are a number of products available and labeled for that use. You mix them up with water and then pour it on the mound, and there are a few products that are intended to be used as a dry treatment, either as granules or a dust that you put on the top of the mound. These are really popular for our golf course folks because the guy that goes around first thing every morning and rakes all the sand traps, or the guy that mows the greens first thing in the morning could just take a container of these products with him, and every time he sees a fire ant mound, he can just dust it over the top and move on. He doesn't have to carry a 5-gallon bucket full of water to treat every mound. So some of the commonly used baits, these are the active ingredients on the left-hand side, and some of the names, and I'm not going to pretend that these names are current because they change constantly. You have the same active ingredient with a different brand name, and you can also have a brand name with a different active ingredient. So there's no fidelity here at all in this industry. But some of the ones that are really familiar to almost everyone, the Amdro and Amdro Pro, which has hydromethanol in it, and then a bunch of other names there. The hydromethanol plus methoprene, which is Extinguish Plus. Those two are labeled about as widely as any of the baits that we have. In fact, those two are labeled in the Deep South, at least, for pasture application, which Tim, I'm sure, will talk to you about in a little while. Most of these others are not labeled for pasture application, so you need to read your labels fairly carefully. When we talk about spreading fire ant bait, it depends on how many acres you're going to treat. If I were working for a county or a city that had a fair amount of parkland and athletic complexes, it's well worth it to invest in one of these little four-wheeler or even pickup truck mounted spreaders to do the job. The problem we have is that most of our baits are labeled to go out at about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of bait per acre. And I don't know if you've ever tried to calibrate one of these little push spreaders, but you will not get it down to 1 pound per acre, because you'll think nothing's coming out. It's just too little product moving out through that spin wheel, and you'll almost invariably put out anywhere from 4 to 6 or 8 pounds per acre, thinking you've got it down as low as it'll go. That'll give you control, but it'll also cost you way more money than it should. And you can use these small handheld spreaders like this for small areas or landscaped areas that are irregular, where it's more difficult to throw it out with these push spreaders. And what I use in my yard now is I get a small container of bait and I just sprinkle it out through the shaker can. The nice thing about the baits is you don't have to have perfectly uniform application, because the ants will come find them, and that takes some of the pressure off your application technique. For mound drenches, let me just say, this guy up here with the watering can obviously retired and has lots of time on his hands. You need to put at least 2 gallons of water on every medium-sized fire ant mound that you're going to drench. So you need a bucket, not a watering can. And then the dry materials, this is orthene here, that is one of the more popular products to sprinkle on the top of the mound, so you don't have to carry water with you. And again, remember David's discussion of how the fire ant mound functions. There aren't any entrance and exit spots on top of the mound. They're all out to the side. And most of the time when you're going to drench a bait, or if you're going to dust it over the top, you don't want to disturb the mound. You just want to put your stuff there, because otherwise, as David said, the workers are going to take that brood and either take it very deep in the mound or go out these side tunnels and relocate. And how much is there down there? This is an aluminum cast of the interior of a fire ant mound. It's about 3 feet tall, I'm told. You can check all these out at anthillart.com. That's why it takes 2 gallons of water to get to the bottom of the mound, which is probably where the queen and the brood are in warm weather. So your chemical control for drenching or otherwise treating over the top for fire ant control. Acephate is the orthene that goes as a powder, which is very popular for dusting over the top of mounds. 7 is on its way out. It's a very old material, and I think they're probably going to quit making it very soon. Fipronil is the gold standard. It is restricted use, so most homeowners can't get hold of it, although I think the internet makes restricted use almost archaic idea. But it's sold as Chipco Choice, Top Choice, and the Taurus Trio, along with a number of other generic names. The pyrethroids are the most common contact insecticide sold in garden centers and big box stores for homeowner use. The pyrethroids are a class of insecticides, the active ingredients of which all end in THRIN. So Talstar is a very familiar name for most people working in ornamentals and turf and landscape entomology. The active ingredient there is bifenthrin, but other things like cyfluthrin, cypermethrin, permethrin, lambda-cyhalothrin, deltamethrin, all of those things that end in THRIN are pyrethroids, and they all behave more or less the same, although there is something of a spectrum in terms of how long you can expect the effects of an application to last. Permethrin is the oldest and probably has the shortest residual time for you. Talstar, the bifenthrin, in my experience, probably has the longest, but even then you're only talking about a few weeks and certainly not a whole season. And spinosad is bacterial fermentation byproduct that you can actually find some formulations that are certified organic. For people that prefer to use organic controls, there are baits and EC type formulations to be sprayed out that are certified organic that have spinosad as the active ingredient. And while we're looking at this, let me just say that for me, the pest control industry does an excellent job of obscuring what exactly is going on in the packaging for fire ant treatments. And I'm pretty familiar with this stuff, and I've spent a lot of time staring at the shelf trying to figure out what the hell some of these things were. You can buy a bag of permethrin granules that says right on it, it will give you 12 months of control for fire ants. And I don't know anyone anywhere who thinks that's true. You will get 2 weeks most of the time. Maybe if you're really lucky and the stars are right, you might get 3 weeks, but that's about it for permethrin, in my experience. You need to be careful about how you interpret labels on these things. And then the last one that I wanted to point out to you is this guy down in Central Florida who has come up with a device that sprays hot water into the mound. I think I tested a wand very much like this probably 25 years ago. It's just a copper tube with one I had a rifle bullet on the end to give it a point so you could just stab it into the mound. The one I tested was designed to spray insecticides, and it had a number of holes for about the last foot of the wand there. So you stab it down in the mound and then pull the trigger and it sprays pesticide from bottom to top. The problem with that is that you had to be sure you had it fully inserted before you pull the trigger, or it would spray that pesticide on your shoes because the top holes were more than a foot from the tip. So if you had hard ground or for some other reason you couldn't get the entire thing down in there, it had the potential to be dangerous. And that potential liability is probably why it was never developed commercially back then. Hot water is probably a little more benign in terms of getting it on your feet. Or maybe not if it's hot enough, come to think of it. So for best results when you're using any of these, you need to apply when the ants are actively foraging for your baits, and there are easy ways to tell if the ants are foraging. Probably the easiest is to put out some cheap store brand potato chips that are good and greasy, or a piece of hot dog, or some peanut butter, not right on the mound, but a little ways out from the mound, and leave it there 15 minutes. And if you come back and there are no ants on it, then they aren't foraging. If you come back and they are, then you're in good shape. Fire ants generally forage somewhere between about 65 to 70 degrees if it's sunny, up to about 95 degrees. If it's hotter than that, they stay down in the ground until after dark. If it's colder than that, they just stay down in the ground. You can pick the window when the ants are foraging. Don't put your bait on top of the mound. Put it, if you're treating for a mound treatment, put it away from the mound a foot or so, and do not disturb the mound. If you're using one of these contact insecticides for a mound drench, as I said, be sure you put at least 2 gallons of solution for every medium-sized or larger mound. For granules, apply evenly over the entire area and irrigate after application. And then for your liquid sprays, you want to be sure you're applying at least 50 gallons per acre. And if it's in turf, mow that turf before you put it out there. The reason for that is you want that liquid spray to get to the soil surface And the more turf canopy there is, the more of your volume and more of your insecticide winds up off the ground on the grass plant, where it's probably not going to kill any ants. So there are a number of reasons why you might have problems with failure to control the ants. For the mound treatment, if you don't put enough water, forget it. You're not going to get good control. They'll just move probably. Maybe you didn't treat all the existing colonies. They aren't all the same size. They can be started. In Florida, they swarm every month of the year. A queen goes in the ground and starts a new colony, but she's down there with that first brood for a month before any of those workers start to break out to the surface and forage on the surface. So if she's down there and you kill all the colonies on the surface, when her first workers break to the surface, they got the place all to themselves. And you could look at that as a colony established after treatment, but there's always a chance of colony being established after your treatment. Particularly if you've got mound treatments, you're not really going to have any impact on anything that invades after the day or so of the treatment, unless they land right where that mound was. You're not really getting much in the way of residual control over the whole area. The same with baits. If you put out a bait, if the fire ants are actively foraging, they will pick essentially all of it up in about 30 minutes. So you don't have residual control after weather conditions at the time of treatment. If it's really wet, there's been some work, and David did some of it looking at wet conditions and the effect on baits, and they are surprisingly effective even after they've been rained on or irrigated. But you don't want a real drenching rain, because that moves the bait away and pounds it into the dirt where the ants may not find it. Again, that same problem with colony established after the treatment, because you are not expecting any residual control from a bait application. If you've got a mixture of colonies, those larger ones with the most workers are probably going to get most of the bait and maybe get almost all of it, and leave the smaller ones behind, which allows them to grow unchecked by competition from the bigger ones. David mentioned the polygyne colonies. We have less satisfactory results from treating polygyne colonies, and you probably will have to make more than one application to really get your control where it needs to be. And then there's those expectations. If you put out the bait tonight and then go back 3 days later and you're disappointed that there are still ants moving around, you really didn't understand what you should have expected. And here's another thing that doesn't work. Along with those grits and the carbonated water and the other home remedies that you see all the time on the internet, this guy took an old TV set and made basically a magnifying glass to create a death ray to kill fire ants with. That's a big thing to run around chasing fire ants with, and needless, it will also fry the plants if you happen to hit them. An interesting idea. Guy was creative, but it's not going to take the place of Amdro, I don't think. And for the one last thing I would suggest is it could be worse. We got Solenopsis, 2 species of Solenopsis, and it was bad, but it could have been worse. There are plenty of other ants down in South America, which actually I think as an ecologist you would say is probably the #1 control for fire ants down in South America, is competition with other much badder ants. This is a mound made by a species of a harvester ant. This is actually up in Washington State. For some reason, the people up there imported this ant to pile these needles up so that they wouldn't be scattered all out on the ground everywhere, so it would somehow reduce the danger of wildfire. There are a number of testimonials on the internet because this is on a training base for the Army, and there are a number of testimonials from former cadets and recruits that train in this area that make it clear that laying down near or on one of these harvester ant colonies is a memorable experience. So we don't want that one either. And I guess with that, I have a little bit of time for questions if you want to ask them. I'll be glad to do that, Dan.
Very good stuff. We do have some questions, and some of these were from the last presentation. I thought they were probably more appropriate for you or Tim, but can you comment on in the homeowner market? And the first question that actually came in was on organic fire ant control on farms and things of that sort. And then the second question was, could you comment on fire ant control in home yards?
There are a few things that are labeled as organic. Probably, unless you're hooked into the organic network, you're probably going to have to look pretty hard to find them in most places. But spinosad is available, and it's a good bait. It's been used for a long time, and it also comes as liquid formulation that you can spray. If you're talking about home gardens, which I get a lot of questions about that, there are a lot of things that are labeled for home yards that are not specifically intended for use in the garden. Mm-hmm. But if you have a routine fire ant control program with putting baits out around your yard, most of the time the fire ant colony is not located in your garden spot. They don't like to be disturbed that often, so it's probably off to the side and they're just foraging over there. So the bait would be effective that way. And there are also some soil treatments that you could make with bifenthrin or something like that before you planted the garden to stop any activity or maybe control a lot of the workers. And then once you till the garden and plant your vegetable plants, you're not going to be legal plant using that product on your vegetable garden. So you have to play with it, but that's not unusual. No ants is an expensive goal to go for. And if you've got a park, where most of the time people are just out there walking and throwing frisbees, you don't need no ants in those areas. No mounds is good enough. But then on the 4th of July, they have a concert and fireworks and everybody brings their blankets and picnic baskets out and sits on the ground. At that point, you do need no ants. And achieving no ants short term is a whole lot cheaper than doing it year round. Okay. So for $5 an acre, you can spray bifenthrin and put a stop to fire ant activity for several weeks in the area where you expect people to be sitting on the ground, and then let it go back to what it was before. Yeah. So there's a mixture of strategies that you can use, and it's the same with your yard.
Would you consider Amdro to still be a standard in the over-the-counter market? It's been around forever, and I remember it was just hydromethanol, but it now contains methoprene as well. So if you get that dual acute toxic and plus growth regulator. So is Amdro still the standard in the over-the-counter market?
Oh yeah, I think so. For the big box stores, for sure, that's probably their number one seller. And the Extinguish, a lot of people like it because it's not a toxicant. It's an insect growth regulator. So it's not that hydromethanol is not safe to use in your yard around people, kids and pets and birds and stuff. But the Extinguish is absolutely, if you don't have a chitinous exoskeleton, it's not going to bother you. Yeah, that works fine. And Amdro also comes in a formulation that goes out at, I think, 2 pounds per thousand, or maybe they just say 100 pounds to the acre. And what they've done is taken that 1.5 pounds of actual bait and mix it with a lot of blanks that don't have hydromethanol on them.
Oh, okay.
And so that's much, much easier to spread accurate with a push spreader or something like that. And they sell it in bags that are like 25 pounds. So that would treat your 1/4 acre of grass or 1/2 acre of grass, whatever you need to do. So the Amdro they're still very much a big player in the market for sure.
Yeah. How about the number of baitings per year, Will? Is there a time to bait or the number of baitings per year? Or do you just play that by ear, or what's the general rule of thumb?
I still do in my yard twice a year. I do it in the spring when it warms up enough that ants are real active. And then I do it again in September to weaken those colonies and try to knock them back before they go into the overwinter. When we first started doing all this in some of the larger commercial areas, office parks and things like that, after a couple of 3 cycles of the bait, they found that they could just apply the bait around the edges in a donut instead of the entire 10 acres or whatever it is, because that's where the reinvasion was coming from. It was drifted in from the edges. And that way you save potentially a good bit of your control cost each time because you're not treating the entire area. So there are ways to play with cost, and particularly for governmental entities, parks and recreation, stuff like that, their budgets are pretty tight. They do everything they can to hold the cost down.
So have we seen any new baits come on the market in the past? It seems that kind of has stopped. We haven't really seen any new fire ant baits come on the market. Maybe Tim will want to comment on this too, but we still have that series of baits that was it Distance was one? I don't even know if it's still in existence.
Oh yeah, Distance is still a major one. The pyriproxyfen, it's a very common bait. The 2 new ones that I'm aware of are the indoxacarb and metflumizone, the Avion and Siesta, and Avion's probably 10 years old now.
That's right.
Metflumizone is a little bit newer than that. And because they work so much faster, they're a pretty attractive option for a lot of our pest control people. The pest control people have found it difficult to sell the long-term, you're going to apply it twice a year and then you'll wait 3 months or something. You have to do something else fairly quickly after you start that bait program on them, or your clients will go to somebody else. 2 days is not bad. In my experience, you frequently would have to make another application about 8 or 10 weeks later. It seems to me that they don't do quite as complete a job, but the trade-off to do it much quicker is probably well worth it.
Is there a place to go, a website where people can learn about available baits for fire ants? And there used to be a publication, maybe it was that Southeast publication on fire ants. There was a list of baits and a table there on when to apply them.
And there still is that. It's on the Texas A&M website, which is where all of those, that was the repository for all of those. I don't know how frequently it's updated or who keeps up with those names. As I said, the names can change twice during the marketing season. It's really hard to keep up. Yes, Nancy, Tim is going to address that.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of that. I'm making a list of all the kind of loose ends of questions that are coming up. And so I'll hit my assigned topics, but then I'll do some cleanup and see what we can come up with some of that.
Anything else, Dr. Hudson?
Tim's time now, so.
No, we're taking a 10-minute break.
Oh, are you?
Oh, yeah. 3:30 to 3:40, we're going to take a coffee break and we'll resume with Tim back at 3:40. So hearing no other additional questions, let's break for 10 minutes, folks, and then we'll resume with Dr. Davis. Thanks. It was really good stuff. Always a wealth of information there.
All right. Glad to do it.
Thank you, sir. So our next speaker up is Dr. Tim Davis. Dr. Davis is going to talk about management of fire ants in rural environments and pastures and the equipment and calibration used to conduct those types of treatments. Dr. Davis is currently the Chatham County, Georgia, that's the Savannah area extension coordinator and the director of the Coastal Georgia Botanical Gardens here at UGA. He began working with fire ants in the late 1990s. And as the imported fire ant specialist at Clemson University. Dr. Davis has been involved in fire ant research and education program testing new chemistries in the field and developing fire ant management strategies for large systems such as military bases for decades now. And so, Dr. Davis, I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
All right, thank you. Let me get my screen shared here, make sure I get it to the right screen and the right things checked. Do that and then bring up my program. All right, there we go. One of my greatest fears in life is I want to do this. I want to be talking like everybody can hear me and nobody can. So I'm just going to keep on going and somebody can text me if you're not hearing me. So we're going to talk a little bit about rural environments. We're going to talk about pastures. We're going to talk about some of the equipment and kind of draw all this stuff we've been talking about together. And I have been keeping a list of some of the questions. So hopefully I'll answer some of those. And if we don't, we can hit that up as we get going. So when I think about fire ants, we've already talked about these 3 tools. I always think about the 3 tools that we have in the box. And just anytime you build something, one tool isn't always the thing you use. And I can take a hammer and I can make 2 boards out of 1 board with a hammer, but it works much better if I have a saw. And then I have to explain to my wife why I need 5 different kinds of saws because they all cut differently. And so we need to understand each of these 3 tools that we have and then how we use them. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. We have individual mound treatments. That's what IMT is. We have baits, and then we have these broadcast granulars that we've talked about. These are the 3 tools, 3 basic tools in our box and how they work. So we've talked a little bit about this, but individual mound treatments are best when an individual mound is problematic. So you got that one mound that my wife notices and says, "You're the fire ant guy. Why do we have fire ant mounds?" That's when I use an individual mound treatment. Or if you're out in the field, you know, that fence gap, you got to stand in one place to open that electric fence without getting shocked. Wherever that is, you have to stand. Fire ants choose that spot. I'm going to use an individual mound treatment there. If I've done treatments and I've got 1 or 2 mounds that are hanging out, don't want to die, that's again, when they're persistent post-treatment, that's again a really good place. That's that 2-step where we go out with the baits and then we clean up with these individual mound treatments. One of the things I like to remind people is that these treatments are some of the most toxic ones that we have. So you're using a lot of chemical in a small space, and that creates a lot of toxicity in that one spot. So these are things I limit as best I can doing individual mound treatments. I like to show this slide because it was part of the very first fire ant slide show I ever did. That's Dr. Sid Hayes. He was the department head at Clemson for many years. He was there when I was a master's student. I was terrified of him, but it turns out he's my academic granddad. He was my graduate advisor's advisor. And I like to show this slide because it shows you how large a mound can be. And when we start talking about doing individual mound treatments, we have to fill that entire volume, particularly if we're doing a liquid treatment. You really have to think about that. Now, if you're using some of the soluble powders, you don't have to do that quite so much, but you need to understand that we're trying to get this chemical over a large area. The other reason I like to show this slide is Dr. Hayes was a huge railroad fan. And so for his graduate work, one of the things he did was he took one of those pump trolleys like they use in a railroad, and you pump it up and down and it makes it move. He adapted one of those for a pasture, and he mixed some of the toxicants with peanut butter. And as he would go across the field, it would put drops of peanut butter across the field. So some of the very first baits and the concept of baiting was done by Dr. Hayes. And that also brings us to my next topic. And this slide seems to change slow, so I want to see if I can make it work. Yep. See, it changes slow and it goes. So broadcasting baits, for the most part, a lot of our products have instructions on there how to do baiting with individual mounds. And then they have a little short piece about how to broadcast the baits. What we recommend is broadcasting the baits. Most of these are at 1 pound to 1.5 pounds per acre, which isn't a whole lot. And you're spreading that out over an acre, which makes these things very safe for your non-targets. There's been a lot of questions about that. And that's one of the reasons it's very safe, because you're putting about very small amount of toxicant over a very large area. And that's what we do recommend. There is no residual with these. So we recommend doing large areas, larger than an acre, and larger you do, the better. So if I do an acre, it's going to last a little while. If I do 300 acres, it's going to last much longer because you're eliminating the fire ants over that whole area. You do need to these are things that we use when you want to stay away from a sensitive area. So if you have questions about vegetable gardens or wells or pets or whatever, if you want to stay away from those areas, pond, you can treat around the outside edge of this. And because fire ants forage so far away, we've tracked them. It's not uncommon to see them 30 to 100 meters away from their colony. So if we have a sensitive area, we can actually apply these baits away from that sensitive area and let the fire ants travel over there, pick up that bait and bring it back. Most of these baits are very relatively non-toxic to vertebrates. There was a story I was working on the golf course, and they got a sale on the baits, and they bought like 500 pounds of bait and put it in the shed and forgot about it. And it that was in the fall, came back in the spring to go put out the bait, and it was all gone. And he discovered a raccoon had gotten in there and eaten all of it. And the raccoon was perfectly fine, just had a nice glossy skin from all the oils in there. So it's pretty non-toxic. It is toxic to most or some of them are toxic to fish. So you do want to avoid hitting the surface of a pond. If I can't get total coverage, so the situation is complex and I can't get complete total coverage, there's concrete, there's pavement, there's plants. Again, I can put this out. And if I can't get complete coverage, it's going to be okay because the ants are going to pick it up and bring it back. It doesn't really matter which product you use. We get 85 to 95% reduction in our fire ant population if we do everything right. So all of them give us that. Some of them are faster, some of them are slower, some of them we combine in different ways, but they all give us that 85 to 95% control if we get everything correct. So some hints about successful baiting. The baits need to go out when the ants are foraging. So ants are foraging when the surface soil temperature is between 70 and 95 degrees. If it's colder than that, they're not foraging much. If it's hotter than that, they'll pull back, go underground until, as Will said, at night. So your timing is during the summer when it's really hot, you might need to be putting these out in the evening so for the night foraging. But the easiest way to tell is to put out a pre-bait. So you put out a little bit of the fire ant bait you're going to put, cat full, put it down. If you want to have fun, get a bunch of us fire ant people together, get a couple of beers in us, and ask them which one is the best thing for pre-bait. And you're going to have Bart Dries talking about mint apple jelly, and somebody else talking about Vienna sausages, and somebody else hot dogs and potato chips, you name it. They're after the oil, and I don't think it really matters. Bait treatments are most effective when they're broadcast. So we're putting at 1.5 pounds per acre. If we're doing individual mound treatments with fire ant bait, that's probably not the best use of it. You're going to use more of it. It's going to be more expensive, and it's not going to be effective. It will kill every mound you treat. It will kill none of the mounds you don't treat. And that's also the problem with individual mound treatments, period, is that every mound you treat is going to die, but every one you don't see is just fine. And then you're going to tell me you just moved them around. We do need to use fresh bait. So once it's exposed to air, the bait degrades very quickly. So we want to use fresh bait. Usually I order it, have them send it to me straight from the factory, and I put it out within a very short period of time. And then when I want to do it again, I make that treatment. If I buy it at the big box store, I usually reach to the back because they put the new stuff in the back and the front, older stuff up front. And so I'll do that. So it needs to be fresh. It's got soybean oil in it. So once that soybean oil goes rancid or is exposed to air, it begins to degrade and it's not as attractive. And you can actually smell it with your nose when it's not right. Baits need to be applied when it's dry. So when you put these baits out, you've got to put it out. We say we want 8 to 10 hours of dry before it rains or before you irrigate. You don't want to put it out when it's wet. I've never had a problem with wet dew, but we really would prefer that it didn't have even wet dew in the early morning. So we want it dry. And we need to remember that fire ants can forage for a long distance. So we can put it out, and if we miss a spot, baits are really great at that. So the next slide, this was something I did. This is a pre-bait. You can see all the fire ants on there. It was a cap full of fire ant bait. I dropped a cap there, and then a couple feet away over here on the concrete, I dropped another cap full, almost exactly the same amount of time. And what you can see is I had all those ants on the other part, and now I only really have one ant on here, maybe 2 or 3, but not nearly as many. And the difference is not the concrete, the difference is the temperature. That's why it's so important to get that temperature. I don't usually guess at this. If I'm getting ready to put out an, particularly if I'm doing an experiment and I want it to work exactly the way I want it to work, I put out the pre-bait and look for it. Yes, Lisa, pecan sandies are great. And they're also good to keep in your truck because they make good snacks, as do potato chips. Granular broadcast products are best. And primarily here, I'm talking about fipronil, but there are some pyrethroid type products that are available. This is when your premium's desired because this stuff costs about $200 an acre. When I need 100% control. So if you got a playground and you want 0 ants, which is a good idea, this is probably your product and this is probably what you want to do. There was a big case in Texas where a 13-year-old was playing football on a field and he got stung at and by halftime he had died. So 100% control is what you want. This is the product. When you need control in small areas. So one of the nice things about this is I can treat a 1/4 acre and I can keep them out of a 1/4 acre. Now, wherever I stop, fire ants will start again. I had a case I was working on where they treated with fipronil. I thought, it's not, they said it's not working. I thought, I got this. It's not fire ants. I got there and it was fire ants. But they had treated in a straight line and the spreader had tilted and it had not thrown as far on the one side. They missed that and had a straight line of fire ant colony. So wherever you miss, you'll get it. If I'm trying to control these, sometimes you get a call and they'll say, what can I do? And it's winter time. It's not a good time to put out your baits. These products work pretty well on that. They do give you longer term control. The homeowner products do not. Will alluded to this, that when you purchase those homeowner products out of there, the rates on those are much lower than the professional products. And so the homeowner products really don't give you much time. And if you read the label carefully, there's a difference between year-long control and season-long control. Season's like 3 or 4 months. And I think that's even being generous. But year-long control or 12-month control is different. If you're using some of these professional grade granular products, you can get 12 months or longer of control. Products usually guarantee a year. And I've got some places that went way longer than that. The thing about broadcast granulars, none of them are labeled for pastures or agricultural uses. So I get people asking about that all the time. There are some termiticides that have some of those same active ingredients. I get asked about that all the time. And the answer is that is used in a product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling, and that is illegal. So how are we going to get these out? There's several different ways. If you're doing really large areas, I think my daily record was 6,000 acres. We did it with the plane. And if you're working with an aerial applicator, there are some adjustments they need to make to their aircraft. And we have plans of how to do that. Basically, they have to have a air intake that keeps the bait fluffed up. So they basically have a modification for that. If you need that, contact me. I'll let you know. We use herd seeders a lot for the baits, push spreaders. And I'm going to talk about where we use each of those a little bit. And I'm going to spend a good bit of time or a little bit more time on the herd seeder. This is another slide that always works slow for some reason. There you go. Okay. So herd seeders, I don't have a bit of problem telling you to buy a herd seeder because everything I've tried, there's nothing even close to what a herd seeder does. David Hurd was an engineer and he put this together and he worked with a lot of us. You can get all kinds of mounts for them. They can go on all kinds of things from, as you see, from a pickup truck to a four-wheeler. I'll put them on gators, on Kawasaki mules, you name it. They have a number of modifications. Will alluded to community programs where a community or a subdivision gets together and treats the whole thing. This one on the red truck, that was designed for that. It actually has a blower on there and they just modified a leaf blower and it has a chute and that thing will shoot the fire ant bait about between 30 and 40 feet. So they were able to drive down the roads of the subdivisions and treat everybody's front yard from the road. And that was a modification that was made on that one. They're really easy to calibrate because Vicki Bertinelli, who's on here, and Fudd Graham and Kelly Palmer, they did a lot of work with this. So herd seeder calibration is pretty easy. They come with these plates. If you're a NASCAR fan, you're probably familiar with the concept of a restrictor plate, and that's what they are. There's 4 plates. One of my plates is missing because it's not missing. It's on my herd seeder. Those are different size holes. And what you can do is you can go, they have a publication that they put together that comes with your herd seeder. And this is, like I said, a lot of this work was done by Fudd Graham and Vicki and Kelly. But basically, you can choose your plate size. So you get a number 1 plate and you choose your product, Extinguish Plus or Extinguish Pro. And they've got a whole bunch of different baits they did this with. So you got those products, you choose your plate. It tells you how fast you need to go. Most of these put out about a 20-foot swath, and that will bring you to 1.5 pounds per acre. If you're doing a pasture, 10 miles an hour is like really fast. You don't want to do that because it'll beat you to death. If you want to slow that down, you go to a smaller plate, a number 2 plate, and you can go between 4 and 5 miles an hour on that with this product and get 1.5 pounds per acre. So it's really pretty easy. The other numbers in here of how many ounces per 30 seconds, you can collect that and then weigh it. And if you get that many ounces in 30 seconds, that tells you you're in the right ballpark. And it's a really easy way to check it. I used a handheld GPS. So I'm sitting there with a handheld GPS, giving me my speed. And so I can keep my vehicles at that speed. If you're not able to do that, you might want to look at this where it has the how long it takes to cover 100 feet. Very simple. And it's very effective at getting it at 1 pound to 1.5 pounds per acre. I use a herd seeder pretty much anytime I'm doing a treatment that's larger than an acre because it's accurate, it's fast. I think I've done as much as 300 acres. I know they did some work at Talladega, and I think they did 1,300 acres, and they lined up several gators, I think 13 or 14 of them, and then they had a pace car up front that told them exactly how fast to go, and they treated, I think, 1,300 acres that day. So it's an extremely good spreader, very durable spreader. And in the scheme of things, they're about, with a spreader and a bracket, run about $500 plus or minus a little bit. So it's fairly inexpensive if you're doing larger areas or doing it on a regular basis. Small areas, we use handheld spreaders. In the olden days, I used one of the green ones. And you'd set, there's a little lever on there or switch on there, and you'd set it until it just barely came out. You'd squeeze the trigger and spin and try to walk the same pace. And it worked pretty well. We did a lot. I'd have done a lot of acres with this, a lot of lawns with this. A few years ago, Scott's came out with this product called the Whiz. Again, I don't have a problem telling you about the name on this one because I haven't seen anybody else with a similar product. I did do quite a bit of testing with the Whiz to make sure that it actually did put it out. I like it because one is it has more adjustments, so I can adjust it better. It's electric. So if I'm doing a large area or like an acre, I can lock it open, lock it on and walk. With the other one, holding that trigger down for an acre, my hands would cramp up. It was a pretty good product. And then, of course, being the experimenting person that I am, my son didn't particularly like this idea of him being my herd seeder. Probably not the best recommendation on that one. For some of these residuals like Fipronil, Top Choice, Taurus G, Qualipro, any of the Fipronil products, we use a push spreader, and that's usually the best way to do it. I cheat on calibration with these too. So what I do is I open it up so it barely comes out, and I measure my area and I put that amount of product in the hopper. So if I'm treating a 1/4 acre, I put the amount of product for a 1/4 acre in there and then open it up just a little bit, and I go this way, and then I do 90 degrees from that, and then maybe 45 from that until it's all gone, and you get pretty evenly spread that way. I know commercial operators, you probably don't want to do that because it means multiple times over the same area, but it is a very efficient way to get very good coverage. So those are the ways we apply these products. So here's what we do. Start coming down to recommendations. I'm going to give you a couple of scenarios that we did in the past, and then we'll start talking about pastures and apply some of this stuff. So this was a hunt club. They invited me to come hunt if I would come control the fire ants. So what we did was the property belonged to Mrs. Jones. She was all the time fussing about her house. And so I did about a quarter acre or half acre with the fipronil because that was out in her yard. She can put all those green dots, those are fire ant mounds. So there's a clump of those fire ant mounds right by her clothesline, and there was a bunch of them up by her mailbox. So I treated it with that. The game station, we shot some deer, and I was the youngest person, so I had to clean everybody's deer, and I was getting torn up by fire ants that night. So I treated around that station. We did a swath of fipronil around the clubhouse. I did them around the pump house because, again, they get in the pump house and electricity, and I was able to keep them out that way. The rest of the area I treated with a bait. So this is about, if I remember correctly, it was about 7 or 8 acres altogether. And I was able to use basically one bag of the top choice. So it was about half an acre, and the rest of it we were able to treat with the bait. And I must have done a good job because they never called me back to treat their fire ants. They also never called me back to hunt. We did a pretty good job with that, and it works very well. And that's just combining those 3 tools as we did. So I left them some product that if they had a mound that was problematic, they could treat it. And they never really seemed to have a problem with that. This is Dewey's Island. This is a barrier island off of Charleston. It's about 2 miles from the mainland. They were calling because they were having fire ant problems. And what they have is this green spot down here in the bottom. That was a public area. There was a swimming pool and a clubhouse there. This kind of purple and blue up here, that was a soccer field. And it was an area where when there were medical emergencies, they would land a helicopter. And what was happening was the fire ants were getting up into the approach lights and knocking those approach lights out, and helicopters were having to land blind. They actually had a medical emergency and everybody got their cars and shine their headlights on the landing zone. So we wanted to fix that. It also had all these roads. And as we looked at it, it was maritime forest, but these roads had fire ants along the access. What we did was, realizing that because this clubhouse is close to water and the fipronil product has to be 50 feet from water, we realized that really wasn't going to do them any good. So we used a bait in that area. We went up to this area with the soccer field and the landing zone, and we used bait on most of the soccer field area. And then the landing zone, we used fipronil because it was far enough from the water that was safe. And then on these roads, we measured them using a GIS. We just traced out the roads and then added a 40-foot buffer. And that told them exactly how many acres they needed for that product. So the roads were 26 acres. So we knew exactly how much product to get for that kind of gold colored transition area. They decided not to treat that, but they did have fire ants in that area, but they decided not to treat it because it was a transition zone. It was environmentally sensitive. We could have done a plane, but they didn't want to spend the money on that. So that all worked out. The other thing that they did was, there's one access to this island by boat over here on the northwest corner. And so people would bring in plants for their landscapes. They were required to use native plants, but they'd still bring them in by boat. And so what they did was they implemented a quarantine that they would bring those plants in, hold them there, and inspect them before they were allowed to go into the landscapes. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that you do where you're using all of your tools, all the things that are available to you to treat large areas. I did something very similar for Fort Bragg, which is 160,000 acres. So we've done this on very large scale. That's where I did the 6,000 acres of bait in a single day. I didn't do it. I didn't fly the plane, but I designed the program. So let's take all these things that we've learned and let's talk about pastures. And one of the things you notice is you've probably seen this picture before if you were paying attention. I think David Oy used it. We all have all the same pictures. So whenever I do one of these with other people, they're going to use my photo, or the photos I'm using, aren't they? So they do. So let's talk a little bit about pastures and what we can do with that. First thing is, and I have to throw this in here because this is from my PhD dissertation, we found a lot of species of ants in pastures that were not fire ants. So that's the first thing you need to do, is make sure it's fire ants that you're dealing with. I think I have 45 species just in pastures. So you want to make sure that you are dealing with fire ants. And one of the things we did find, if you put these baits out when the fire ants are foraging, they pick it up much faster than these native species. If you put it out when it's too cool or too hot, some of these other species will be impacted. We also know that if we knock back the fire ant population and don't impact these native species, fire ants will come back, but it takes them longer than it does when you knock out everything and there's nothing but fire ants. Okay, we've seen some of these impacts. You've seen the picture of the heron. There's a lot of native impacts on wildlife, and it's not always just direct eating the chick. It's a lot of times it's competing for the same food. Impacts on equipment, impacts on your people. So there are tons and tons of impacts. A lot of people ask me, are there any good things? We do see reduction of arthropod populations, such as flies, chicks, tigers, and caterpillars. That's their main source of food. So we do see a reduction in those. Products. These are the products that I know of that are labeled for fire ants in pastures. So Andro Pro, Esteem, Extinguish Pro, Extinguish Plus, and Carbaryl. Extinguish Plus is a combination of Extinguish and Andro, are the same products in there. Those are the baits that are labeled for that. Carbaryl, I put that in there because there's a number of liquid formulations, and we're looking about doing mound trenches with that. It's the only one I know of that's labeled for individual mound treatments in pastures. So those are the products that are available. Need to read a label. That's where you get your pesticide credits. When we mentioned that you got to read the label, because all the labels are a little bit different. Some of them, and depending on your state, they actually interpret the labels a little bit differently. So I'm not going to go into a lot of that, but just make sure that you read those labels and make sure it is labeled for pastures, make sure it is labeled for broadcast, make sure that it's interpreted that way in your state. Because like I say, from state to state, there are different interpretations of how these things are interpreted. So with our current technologies, we know that we can reduce the bait or reduce the fire ant population by 85 to 95% using a bait in pastures. And it doesn't matter which one of those baits you use, we get 85 to 95% reduction if you do everything right. We have broadcast treatments. We can reduce the fire ant population by 99+%, but they are not labeled for pastures. So you are going to be using these baits if you're going to be doing pasture treatments. You're not going to be putting that top choice out there, again, because it is not labeled for that. Plus, it's $200 an acre. So, if you got any size pasture at all, that's probably not the best choice. And that's the big problem. It's cost. So putting these out twice a year, and by the time you say, okay, $15 to $20 per acre for each treatment, I add labor, I add my equipment, my fuel, and I'm going to do this a couple times a year. I think a farmer needs to spend some time thinking about, can I afford this? Are the impacts monetarily greater to me than the cost of treatment? And the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. So I'm going to put this together in some recommendations. So let's manage, if we're going to manage fire ants using baits or granular products in areas that matter the most. So rather than treating the whole farm, 350 acres or whatever size the farm is, and I don't necessarily need to treat the whole thing. I need to think about where my impacts are. So I'm having problems with fire ants around the barns, around the gates, around the stockyards, our homes, electrical storage, electrical equipment storage, hay storage, calving pens. Those are the areas where your impacts are. So by the time I say, oh, I'm just going to treat those areas, I reduce that from 350 acres to maybe 5 acres. Now that's something that I can deal with, and it's less expensive. So target those high impact areas. So you have to really look at the property and say, where's the problems? Are there problems where we have a calving pen, she's dropping her calves there and the calves are getting hit by fire ants? Am I losing bales of hay to fire ants getting up in them? Maybe I move all my hay to a storage area, treat that area for fire ants, and then move my hay to that storage area. And now I have a more or less fire ant free zone where I can put that hay and I have less impact on my entire hay. So that's how you're making that decision. If you have one of those fields like that picture a few slides ago, it's just you're in clay and you got these big mounds everywhere, and maybe that's a place where you do treatments. But those mounds, if they're clay, they're not going away. You're going to have to do something to knock those mounds down. So you got to think about all those things. I think the other place for pastures, if you have high value animals. So if you've got horses or companion animals and people place a high value on it, they're willing to spend that money and that amount of money. And it's very effective to treat a pasture a couple times a year. I think one of the questions was timing on that. Normally, I don't start looking at using baits until sometime in May. We can get away with it earlier sometimes, but generally I can say, okay, May timeframe, I can do a broadcast treatment, and then I can turn around and do it again in September. One of the things I've discovered is both in South Carolina and here in Savannah area, if I wait until October, it gets wonky, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And that just has to do with warm days and cold nights can cause you issues. And so that's the thing. We've done a lot of work through the years. Some of the work I did with David was we had an area-wide project, and we treated 300-acre pastures, and we looked at pastures where we had the Neelahasia and where we had flies. And one of the things we saw that when you combine biological controls, which are available now naturally because we've released these in a lot of places, and you combine that with the baits, we get much longer control than we got with the baits alone. And then just thinking about what area you are using and targeting the problem area is really the key with that. And I can't believe I'm a few minutes early on this. I'm ready to take questions.
Really good stuff, Tim. Thank you. We did have several questions came in, enough to probably finish up the time here. One question came in about cultural practices. So in pastures, for instance, are there things that can be done, I don't know, with a drag or cutting the grass or doing things to disturb colonies? Will they actually move?
There's been a good bit of work on that. And the answer is no, it doesn't work very well. People used to say, we don't see fire ants on golf courses because you mow all the time. You mow all the time, you flatten them down, you don't see the fire ants. But if you drop bait out there, little hot dog slices or whatever, and you come back, you'll find that there's fire ants there. You just can't see them. If I have an individual mound, somebody was asking about like a garden, can I disturb the mound in there and will it move? Sometimes if I got one mound that's really causing a problem and I disturb it often enough, it'll decide to move. But there's nothing keeping it from moving back, or there's nothing keeping another one from moving in there. So there really aren't a lot of cultural practices that work with fire ants. Somebody mentioned about organics. Spinosad is labeled as an organic product, but the Spinosad fire ant bait is not organic because the defatted corn grit that they use is genetically modified, so it's not considered organic anymore for that reason. The other thing with Spinosad is it's really toxic to ants. And so a lot of times what we see is they'll pick up that Spinosad bait and they start hauling it back to the colony. And they're dying before they get it back to the colony and get it incorporated in there.
No kidding.
And I saw that in Taiwan as I saw these piles of dead ants and fire ant colonies. And I would open up the fire ant colony and there were ants, but no larvae, because if they made it back, they feed it to the larvae first and all the larvae were dead. And then saw these dead ants everywhere. And I turned to them, I said, did you use Spinosad in this field? And it was like this magical thing that was a great guess. And it worked out really well for me to guess that one.
So we have a Georgia County agent has a question here, Tim. Brooklyn Weissel I think she's down in Upton. She's having a hard time finding products for pastures locally. She's down in Barnesville. What's the best way to get Amdro, Extinguish, some of the other products for pastures?
Order them online.
Yeah.
I've got a source. I'm not going to give his name out, but he usually gives me free bait if I call and ask, and I'm not going to give his name because I don't want him to have to give away tons and tons of free bait. And I don't want to ruin my source, but you can order it online. 25-pound bag of Extinguish Plus runs between 200 and 224 pounds or dollars. And that'll treat between 12 and 20 acres, depending on how, if you do pound and a half, it's about 12 acres.
Somebody had a question too, Tim, about baits going rancid. So can you address the whole idea of soybean oil and that kind of thing on Amdro and how rancid how fast?
Yeah, so virtually all of our fire ant baits, and I want to say virtually because you never say never, you never say always, but most of them are on defatted corn grit, which is a product pretty similar to sugar pops, but it's all the same size. They're using soybean oil because soybean oil is fairly cheap, and you can get into an argument about what's the best oil, but they're using soybean oil because they're cheap, and that's the attractant, and that's what the toxicant is dissolved in, and that's what the ants are attracted to. So just if you take soybean oil and set it out and don't keep it refrigerated, it's going to go rancid. So they have them sealed in airtight bags, so it will last fairly well in an airtight bag in a cool, dry place. But if it gets hot, if the air reaches it, that oil will begin to go rancid. And over time, it doesn't take much. You can open it up, close it back up, and come back a few months later, and that will not be as effective as a can that had never been opened.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be effective, but not as effective. But then when it gets totally rancid, you smell it. To me, it smells like paint when it goes rancid. And if I got that, I may apply it because that's the easiest way to dispose of it. But I don't expect that to work as well or at all if it does that. So you want to make sure you have good fresh bait where the seal hasn't been broken and it's been in a cool, dry place. I don't feel good when I get a bag and I put it out in the shed and it's 100 degrees and then the heat gets in there and that shed might get 150 degrees. I don't feel good about that, using that product. Or if I use that product and it doesn't work, I know what happened at that point.
So you said something important a minute ago too, Tim. None of the baits are not actually eating the granule. They're sucking liquid out of the granule.
No, Dave was talking about that fourth instar larvae. They feed it on there. They got a big kind of, in vernacular words, lip, and they put it in there and they digest this stuff externally. So they do not eat solid food. So they're digesting the stuff externally. And then a nurse ant comes along. She strokes that larvae with those antennae. It spits out some of that digestive juice. She takes that in. She goes to another place. Another ant strokes her, and then she eats it and they pass along. That's that process of trophallaxis that Dave was talking about. So what you're trying to do, and this is why a lot of the baits work slowly, is we're trying to get that entire product throughout the entire colony before the ants start dying. Because if the ants start dying, then the rest of the ants don't get the food. You know, it's that old food taster. Kings used to have food tasters, and the king, their food taster would taste the food, and if it was poison, and the food taster would die, and the king would be safe. Well, the way to get around that is use a slow poison, and that's actually really effective because he ate it, he's safe, I can eat it too. So that's what they do. They have this built-in food filter.
And that's good stuff. I had another question here about the use of residuals, contact toxicants within 50 feet of a well. So being concerned about contamination of a well with, I know in the structural pest control industry here in Georgia, the rule of thumb was 75 feet. I don't know, there's not a published number in the rules and regs, but I always would tell a regulator would always say, don't apply liquid within 75 feet of a well.
For example, fipronil, and this isn't well water, it's not groundwater, it's surface water. It has I think it's 50 feet from fresh water and 25 feet from brackish. Or the other way around. You have to be at least 25 feet from 50 feet from brackish and at least 25 feet from fresh. To me, the answer is if you apply this stuff according to the label, it's going to be safe. If you get off label and you get crazy, then you're going to run into issues. Fipronil and bifenthrin both bind very quickly to organic matter in the soil. So they don't actually move very far off target. And so that's a nice piece in that is because they bind to that organic matter so much, they don't move very much. Now, if I pick up that soil and move the soil in there from erosion, then that could have an issue. And that's why we put the distances in there. And it is pretty toxic to some of the invertebrates that you find in the water. So you don't really want to get it in the water.
Yeah, we always warn when we're talking to master gardeners and homeowners, be really careful about if you're going to put an acephate dust on a fire ant mound or apply pyrethroid granulars or anything of that sort. Pyrethroids are very toxic to fish. You want to make sure that if you get any granules on concrete surfaces that you blow those off or sweep them off somehow back onto the grass.
Correct. Yeah. And I've seen that happen. Again, oil and water, this is in oil. So oil and water don't mix. And so that's kind of what happens with that. If you've got 8 to 12 hours before it rains and the ants are actively foraging, they're probably going to pick that up off your hard surface in that amount of time. In fact, they pick up a large portion of that bait within the first 3 or 4 hours.
Tim, did you ever use a drone to apply baits?
I did not. I know some people have been playing with it. I know Fudd and Kelly were playing with using drones to do that. That technology came after my time of doing crazy, insane things. I think there's some possibilities there. I think payload creates an issue for you in that. So you'd have to have a fairly big drone and a system that does that. You also get, like when we were doing helicopter stuff, the downwash on the helicopter would change the pattern of the application. And so they would have to make adjustments on how to do that. So I don't know what the current status is of using the drone, but I think there would be some barriers that you'd have to overcome. But I know Fudd and I think Kelly Palmer have been playing with it. I don't know the status of where they are with that.
The other question, one last question here, Tim, before we move on. It seems that, and I get this question all the time. It seems that I'll look at a yard or my yard, and there's no fire ants there. Then we get 2 inches of rain one night, and I've got 10 fire ant mounds in my yard. What happened?
It happens in October. I get the whole, it rained, they came with the rain.
Yeah.
It's been hot and dry all summer, and then you get a
Yeah.
little bit cool weather, and that's where truth is they're there all the time, the whole time. And again, if you drop baits, and I've done this where you cut up a little hot dog, there's a little slices and you lay it out in the transect every 10 feet, you're going to find there's fire ants there, but you're not seeing them because remember David told you that they build that mound up and down to control the temperature in that colony. So when it's hot, they flatten it out so it doesn't get all sunny. And you're mowing it all the time. So it's flat and you don't see it. And then it rains and they build that mound up to control the moisture. So I've actually been in salt marshes and they'll build their mound up between tides to keep it dry and move it back up and down just with the tide. So they're controlling the moisture as well as the temperature. So when you get that rain, they build that up to control the moisture. And so, yeah, you thought you had nothing. And the key is you thought you had nothing and you really did. And the way to check that is you can run baits when at the appropriate time and they'll be on there.
Yeah. Put your money on fire ants.
Put your money on fire ants.
Yeah. All right. Very good. Thanks, Dr. Davis. Really good stuff. Good bookend to everything